You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Welcome back, fellow travelers through the book of Exodus. We have come a long way. We are in chapter 10 this week, and hopefully you are not too plagued out because we still have a few more to go. This week we have two really interesting ones. We have the Locusts and darkness. We also have a super cool hyperlink back to Joseph's story from the end of Genesis that I guarantee you have never noticed is here before. We're going to be hitting on some really unique details in this episode that you would not pick up on the first time you read through the chapter. So this is not the kind of stuff you are going to be hearing in a church service about Exodus. Wow, that kind of came out a little bit harsher than I meant it to. But you know what? I stand by it. We need more preachers who are willing to actually dig down into the text, learn a little bit of the original languages, get some actually good resources instead of just some 100-year-old commentary that they pulled off of their shelf. Man, we are not even a minute into this episode, and we just that narrowly avoided a rant with Colin. That's going to be a fun day. Let's get into Exodus chapter 10. We'll start off with reading the first 11 verses of the chapter. And Yahweh said to Moses, "Go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I might show these my signs before him, and that you may tell in the ears of your son and of your son's sons what things I have wrought in Egypt, and my signs which I have done among them, that you may know that I am Yahweh." And Moses and Aaron came in to Pharaoh and said to him, "Thus says Yahweh, God of the Hebrews, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go, that they may serve me. Else, if you refuse to let my people go, look, tomorrow I will bring locusts into your coasts, and they'll cover the face of the earth, that no one will be able to see the earth. And they will eat the residue of that which is escaped, which remained to you from the hail, and they will eat every tree which grows for you of the field. And they will fill your houses, the houses of your servants, the houses of the Egyptians, which neither your fathers nor your fathers' fathers have seen since the days that were upon the earth to this day." And he turned himself and went out from Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's servants said to him, "How long is this man going to be a snare to us? Let the men go, that they may serve Yahweh their God. Don't you know that Egypt is yet destroyed?" And Moses and Aaron were brought again to Pharaoh, and he said to them, "Go, serve Yahweh your God. But who are they that will go?" And Moses said, "We will go with our young, and with our old, with our sons, and with our daughters. With our flocks, with our herds we must go, for we must hold a feast unto Yahweh." And he said to them, "May Yahweh be so with you if I let you go, and your little ones. See to it, for the evil is before you." Not so. Go now, you men. Serve Yahweh, for that's what ye desired. And they were driven out from Pharaoh's presence. Verse 1 should make attentive readers of the text pause, because this is the first time that it reads that God made the hearts of not just Pharaoh, but also of his servants heavy. And quick reminder here from previous episodes, I know I've been harping on this, but it's really important that we understand. When you read in so many English Bibles that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, that does not have the connotation that we tend to think of it as having. And we've gone over this in plenty of previous episodes, so I'm not going to hash out all the details. But in this particular instance, the word is that kavod word for weighing heavily on. So this does not necessarily mean that God forced Pharaoh to do something that he would not have otherwise done. This is also not the strengthening word that we have talked about before. This particular word just indicates that God has made Pharaoh's heart burdened over this issue. This is weighing very heavily on his mind. And there is also the element of Egyptian mythology where the Pharaoh's heart would get weighed against a feather to determine how he maintained order in the land. So I believe there is a serious subtext through all of this that with each passing decision, where Pharaoh is making it so that he himself would not be welcomed into the afterlife as a successful Pharaoh. And now his servants are being affected by this as well. And we've talked about this before, but the word servants also means slaves, but it is a generic enough term that it could be referring just to his palace staff, his advisors. It seems like maybe his inner circle is at play here, the bureaucrats who actually ran Egypt. And what the King James has as "show these my signs before him" here in verse 1 is literally, you ready for this? Place these signs of mine in his entrails. Most translations today have it as "among them." That's just how they've translated it. Show these my signs among them. And that is a possible translation, and that seems to suggest that Yahweh is going to show these signs amongst the people of Pharaoh's court. Possible translation, for sure. But it is most literally his innermost parts that are being referred to here. The Hebrew calls them entrails, what we would call heart today. So it's a very graphic and a little bit gross picture, but I think it's worth retaining that initial significance because it shows that God's intention here is for these signs to actually make a change in Pharaoh's heart. Deep within him is where these signs are being targeted. His very core identity is going to have these signs embedded in it. It's like he will be, hopefully, a changed person by the end of this. And how long that takes is up to him. You'll also notice the switch back to singular here, despite mentioning his servants right before this. The verse initially read that God was weighing Pharaoh's heart and the heart of his servants, but now it's that I may show these signs in his heart, or in his entrails, in the midst of him. So it's almost kind of like a camera zoom thing here, where it zooms in on Pharaoh, then zooms out to his court, and then back into Pharaoh again. Verse 2 kind of zooms that back out again to a much broader establishing shot, where God says that these signs aren't really about Pharaoh at all. This is not about getting vengeance on Pharaoh. What is the purpose of all of these bad miracles, as I have channeled Nope for several episodes now when referring to these signs? Well, according to verse 2, it's so that you, Moses, and the Israelites can tell in the ears of your children what things I have done in Egypt, the signs I have done among them, and that you may know that I am Yahweh. That sounds really nice and biblical and churchy, so much so that we wouldn't even give it second thought. However, we should give it second thought, because this is not the same rationale that was given for the signs just a chapter ago. In Exodus 9 verse 16, God said that the reason for the signs was so that, quote, my name would be told throughout all the earth. Or more likely, earth is supposed to just be land, meaning the land of Egypt. So the focus has shifted in just a few verses here from this being more of a either global or national thing, at least on the scale of Egypt, to being much more localized to Israel. So that the signs actually have a message to Israel, not just to Egypt. Now, I suppose you could look at this and say that this is a contradiction in the narrative. What is the purpose of the signs? Is it to teach Israel something, or is it to teach Egypt something? And I imagine you could get into all kinds of nerdiness about how this text was edited together and stitched together over time, so that perhaps there were two different versions of this story. One where God said that his purpose was to teach Egypt about him, and then another version of the story where he said that his purpose was to teach Israel about him, and they got smushed together here in chapters 9 and 10. But I think it's also fair to say that any particular action can have more than one motivation. And also, since Israel was within Egypt at this time, I think you could almost say that the purpose in this verse to teach Israel something fits within the purpose stated in chapter 9, verse 16, for his name to be known throughout all the land. I mean, they were living in the land, so kind of the same thing, just a little more specific in this case. Verse 3 has that pretty rare designation again, God of the Hebrews. We talked about that in last week's episode. And when Moses speaks for God here and says, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? That how long is literally to when in Hebrew. It's not great English, but I like the nuance of that. To when are you going to start humbling yourself? And that segues us nicely into a little discussion on humility and humbling, because they become minor themes in Moses' story. Pharaoh had been humbling Israel for 400 years up until this point. Moses would soon be called the humblest man on earth, which is a whole fun rabbit trail since Moses is traditionally said to have written the Torah. So you have Moses saying that about himself, which if you're saying you're the humblest person around, it's probably not true. But that's another passage for another day. Here in this one, we have Pharaoh still refusing to humble himself before this foreign god. So as you read through the Exodus account, keep your eyes peeled for words like humility, humbling, or even humiliating. Those topics form sort of a mini theme throughout this story. And while I definitely don't want to get into the whole sovereignty, free will debate here today, at least not too far, it is worth pointing out that we have God here asking Pharaoh, how long until you humble yourself before me? Implying that Pharaoh had a choice in the matter, that Pharaoh still had free will enough to make this decision, regardless of whatever you may think hardening or strengthening or weighing down his heart may mean. I have known so many Christians who get caught up in these theological debates, particularly between Calvinism and Arminianism and this free will and sovereignty and how much does God control, how much do we control. But you know what? These texts are philosophically sophisticated. Divine determinism and human agency are not contradictory explanations for the way the world works. They're just kind of different ways of describing the same reality. It's kind of like wave-particle duality. I know I'm getting like super nerdy here, but when we're dealing with light in certain contexts, and this is quantum mechanics stuff, it can show as either a wave or a particle. And as far as we know, those two things are supposed to be mutually exclusive. It can be one or it can be the other, not both. And yet, there are some instances where a particular, say, photon will exhibit both traits. And that kind of stuff can be really mind-bending. But I think it kind of works in the realm of theology as well. I don't know, maybe we need quantum theology, where we stop saying that the world either works this way or works that way, that God has to be exactly this way. And maybe there's a lot more nuance and brilliance to the world and things that confuse us and boggle our minds, and maybe that's a beautiful thing. It seems like for the biblical authors, God's working in the lives of humans is just the flip side of the coin of humans working in their own lives as well. God works through our actions. That's not to say that God can't ever work independently of us, but think about how rarely in life we see some ridiculously miraculous thing where you go, oh, that's absolutely 100% God. I mean, I would argue that doesn't ever happen, because if it did, there would be no atheists. There is nothing in life that is ever just 100% only attributable to God. There is always some human element in it that we can look to as well. And more often than not, the human element is far more prevalent than any part of it that we would attribute to God. And maybe that's not as awkward or even heretical as that may sound at first. Maybe that's just how God works. He works through us. That's the picture that the biblical authors had. We should be careful not to either or God, and not to either or our theology as well. Sometimes the answer is both and. As we move into verse 4, we see that God has given Pharaoh a whole night still to change his mind. He warns that he is going to bring locusts into your coasts, and coast there just means borders. So he says, let my people go that they may serve me. And remember, we've talked about this word serve being the same word for slavery. So this is God saying to Pharaoh, you have been using my slaves and it's time to give them back now. That's a little uncomfortable for us sometimes to think of God's people as being his slaves, but that's just the ancient Near Eastern mindset. So that's just the language of the time. Verse 5 is where we really start having fun here, because there is a translation issue that reveals how our interpretive assumptions shape what we think the text is saying. We like to think that we just come to the text, read it as is, and the text informs us. But the reality is we always have all this stuff going on in the background of our minds that is shaping the way that we are reading the text and what we are taking away from it. So verse 5 reads that the locusts will cover the face of the earth so that one cannot be able to see the earth. Pretty much every English version is going to say something along the lines of the locust covered the surface of the earth or the ground. That's how I always heard it preached. That's what I read in countless commentaries. But stop and think with me for a second. Does that sound possible for locusts to completely cover the surface of the ground? Now, we do not know exactly how big the land of Egypt was at this time, but it's relatively safe to assume that it was significantly larger than the modern land of Israel. Israel is approximately the size of New Jersey. It's roughly 8,000 square miles. So let's just for argument's sake say that for whatever reason ancient Egypt was only the size of Israel. Pretty small. 8,000-ish square miles. Can you imagine 8,000 1,000 square miles of locusts. I found an article online. I'll take it with a grain of salt because online, but it was connected to NASA, and it said that a single locust swarm can cover 460 square miles at a time, and it would have roughly 60 billion locusts in it. So that would be one massive swarm of 60 billion locusts in 460 square miles. You would have to multiply those numbers by almost 20 just to get the locust swarm to cover something the size of the modern state of Israel. And Egypt at this time was certainly bigger than that. So we are talking an absolutely ludicrous number of locusts for this particular interpretation to work. And I know some of you are probably thinking, well, it was a miracle, so all the reasonable ways that the world works go out the window. Well, I would argue not necessarily. If our faith starts to sound ridiculous because of the hoops that we are jumping through in order to claim biblical literalism, I'd say we're actually not doing justice to the text. Because the biblical text is a literary masterpiece, and while there are some absolutely fantastical mythological elements to it, because that's just the way writing of that time was, it is not a ridiculous book. I think we need to give it more credit than rigid literalism does. Here's what I mean. When we look at this verse and we see that the locust covered the face of the earth, we start jumping through hoops to figure out how that could even be possible. And it has led to all kinds of elaborate defenses of this plague's literal possibility. But that is not actually what the text says. See, the word translated face or surface here is literally eye in Hebrew. E-Y-E. Not face, eye. The face of the earth makes us think of the land as a whole. But the eye? What could the eye of the land be? Well, today we know that light enters into the eye and we perceive the world around us. But in an ancient mindset, many believed that light comes out of the eye, not into the eye. So in that mindset, what would be the eye of the earth? The sun. See, the authors here aren't saying that locusts covered the entirety of the ground of Egypt. Rather, they're saying that the locusts covered the sun. It's not that you couldn't see any land, it's that you couldn't see the sun. And who was one of the most significant gods of Egypt? Ra, the sun god. Now don't get me wrong, a whole swarm of locusts covering the ground would be absolutely horrifying to deal with. But imagine being an ancient Egyptian and seeing the sun, the symbol of your main god, being blotted out of the sky. The Egyptians would have likely been wondering if Yahweh killed Ra. This is not just about agricultural devastation. This is cosmic warfare. And it highlights a really crucial hermeneutical point. Too many fundamentalist and evangelical Christians say things like, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. Or we have to take the Bible literally. But like I said earlier, we are always bringing in things that we don't even realize are there into the ways that we read the text. There is no straightforward, unbiased reading of the biblical text. We always have something in our minds that's coloring it. And quite often, it's not as straightforward as we like to pretend that it is, particularly when we're dealing with a different language and a different culture from a completely different time in history. We have to grapple not with what we think literal should mean, but with what it would have meant to the original audience in their language, with their conceptual framework. Our knee-jerk English associations can actually obscure rather than clarify the text's meaning. And this isn't just dealing with the sun situation that we're talking about here. We can talk about this in relation to the earth as well. Many translations will say that this happened over the earth, but that word for earth just means land. Like, specifically, the land of Egypt. And on top of that, it can also just mean ground. But in this particular case, it seems to be mostly just about the territory or the region of Egypt. So when you look at a verse like this, particularly if you're reading an older version like King James, and you see earth, you could be misled into thinking that this sign of locust covered the entirety of the earth. Could you imagine locusts going over the whole globe? And I know you might say, oh, that's ridiculous, but if you have this very rigid, literalistic way of reading the Bible, that's how it could come across. And the very fact that some of you are going, oh, come on, Colin, no one would think that way, shows that we have to consider the context and not just the words on the page in front of us. This is not about some global catastrophe. It is describing a localized but very cosmically significant confrontation. Okay, mini rant over. Moving into verse 6, much like with the frogs, there is now no escape in the palace for Pharaoh. The locusts go even into the houses. And notice the little mic drop on Moses' part here. He is getting bolder. I'd say even snarky. He does not give Pharaoh a chance to respond. He just walks out. That's how verse 6 ends. And he turned himself and went out from Pharaoh. That is crazy. This is the chapter where we see the power dynamic shift between Moses and Pharaoh. And I think both of them knew it. Because by verse 7, we are seeing the cracks in the Egyptian power structure. His own advisors are hearing "Nearer, My God, to Thee" play in the background, and they're staging an intervention. They're saying, get into the lifeboats. The ship is lost. We don't need to go down with it. And I have a hunch that there's a little bit of wordplay going on the part of the biblical author here. I have not seen anyone else comment on this, so I could be completely out of pocket saying this, but it stood out to me. The word translated snare in verse 7 is mokesh in Hebrew, and that sounds relatively similar to the name Moshe that we have for Moses. So you have mokesh and Moshe. Maybe it's nothing, but I can't help but see that as a little bit of wordplay going on here, where the Egyptians are seeing Moshe as a mokesh, a snare in their land. Robert Alter, ever the astute biblical commentator, noticed something really subtle in verse 8 that I appreciate. He points out that even while Pharaoh is caving in, he does not personally send for Moses to be brought back in. There is nothing that says here, and Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron to return. Rather, verse 8 just says, and Moses and Aaron were brought again to Pharaoh. The passivity of that, the passive tense of their being brought, subtly emphasizes how coerced and grudging Pharaoh feels in this moment. You could perhaps also read this as a loss of Pharaoh's agency. It's almost like he is not actively making the decisions anymore. He is being carried along by the weight of his choices. Alter also notes that built into the very wording of these verses is this shift in power, because earlier on, Pharaoh had longer speeches while Moses had shorter demands, and now that has completely flip-flopped. It is now Pharaoh who speaks in brief, unadorned sentences, and it is Moses who deploys quasi-poetic parallelism, lads and old men, sons and daughters, sheep and cattle, in a rhetorical flourish that makes it plain that he will yield in nothing. End quote. Okay, at the start of the episode, I promised you a really juicy hyperlink back to Genesis 50 and the end of Joseph's life that you would not have heard before in church. It is time for that now. Unfortunately, we have not yet gotten through the majority of Genesis in our Bible studies, so I don't have specific episodes to point you back to. We stopped around chapter 12 with the Tower of Babylon incident. But shortly after that, God picks a particular man named Abraham, or Abram at that point, Avram, out of the land of Ur, which would have been around Babylonia, and he picks him to be the particular representative through which he would return all of the people groups of the world back to himself, back to an Eden-like existence. Abraham has a son named Isaac. Isaac has a son named Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. They become the 12 tribes of Israel over time. Well, at the end of Jacob's life, one of his sons, Joseph, ends up in Egypt. And it's a whole thing where Joseph is able to save his family from starvation by moving them all into Egypt. That's what got them all in this situation in the first place. We've talked about that a little bit earlier on in the series. Well, as Jacob dies, Joseph and his family hold a rather elaborate funeral for him, leading a procession out of Egypt along a very scenic route back up to Canaan. So much so that if you were to map out the route they took, it doesn't really make a ton of sense. It seems like they were going quite out of their way on this funeral procession. So, what's going on? Well, Genesis 50 is full of little hyperlinks to our current story in Exodus. The details don't make a lot of sense if you are reading them in Joseph's story, so it's likely that they were added in as foreshadowing for what would come 400 years later. Let me give you an example. Genesis 50 verse 8 mentions the rather strange detail that the children and animals were left in Goshen while Joseph led the rest of the family on the funeral procession. And that's probably not a detail that you were wondering about when you read the story. You probably didn't even know that was in there, even if you read the story yesterday. It's so easy to glaze over and miss because, why would you take animals with you on a funeral procession? Well, whether or not the children and animals went with Joseph and his family in Genesis 50 doesn't matter a ton. But whether or not the children and animals join the rest of the people in the Exodus is a major point of importance, and it's right in this showdown between Moses and Pharaoh. There's some really awesome parallels like this between the end of Genesis and this story in the Exodus. It's so cool how the biblical authors tied together the narrative details so that a story in a completely different scroll would be foreshadowing what's happening in this one. Verse 10 reads a little awkwardly in English, so Robert Alter translated it a little bit smoother to get the idea. He says, the effect is sarcasm for this verse. That is, as much as I am prepared to send off your little ones, may Yahweh be with you. Which is not at all. He also notes that what the King James translates as evil is before you is more than likely a very thinly veiled threat. It could be translated as you are headed for mischief. He also points out a potential wordplay between the Egyptian god Ra and the Hebrew word for harm or evil or mischief here, Ra'ah. And thanks again to Alter for a powerful detail in verse 11, because most English translations will read that they were driven out from Pharaoh's presence. They put in a passive. Moses and Aaron were driven out. They were chased out from Pharaoh's presence. But that's not actually how the Hebrew reads. It's quite literally, he drove them out. And that doesn't make a ton of sense in English because it ends with Pharaoh's presence. So to say he drove them out from Pharaoh's presence, that doesn't read great. You would have to say he drove them out from before his face or something like that. But Alter suggests that it's actually very intentionally written that way because just a couple verses earlier, we read that Moses and Aaron were brought before Pharaoh. So it was passive where he didn't do anything there. They were brought in before him. But now he acts very aggressively and is the one to drive them out from before him. I think there could also be a little bit of biblical theology wordplay going on here as well, because that word for driving out something or someone, it's fairly common in the Tanakh, but it is the same word that shows up when God drove the first man and woman out of the garden in Eden, and when Cain felt like he was driven out from God's presence. So we're going to find later at the end of this chapter that Pharaoh banishes Moses and Aaron from his palace. Kind of like he is envisioning his palace as this Eden that needs to be protected from the sinful Moses and Aaron, when really it is Pharaoh's own sin that has corrupted his land and turned it into an anti-Eden. Maybe I'm stretching a little bit with that, but it came to mind as I studied this and wanted to share it with y'all. Verse 12 begins the actual sign of the locust itself, so let's pick it up there. Yahweh said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the land of Egypt for the locusts, that they may come upon the land of Egypt, and eat every herb of the land, even all that the hail has left. Moses stretched forth his rod over the land of Egypt, and Yahweh brought an east wind upon the land all that day and all that night. And when it was morning, the east wind brought the locusts. And the locusts went up over all the land of Egypt, and rested in all the coast of Egypt. Very grievous were they. Before them there was no such locusts as they, neither after them shall be such. For they covered the face of the whole earth, so that the land was darkened, and they did eat every herb of the land, and all the fruit of the trees which the hail had left. There remained not any green thing in the trees, or in the herbs of the field, throughout all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron in haste, and he said, I have sinned against Yahweh your God, and against you. Now, therefore, forgive, I pray you, my sin only this once, and entreat Yahweh your God, that he may take away from me this death only. And he went out from Pharaoh and entreated Yahweh. And Yahweh turned a mighty strong west wind, which took away the locusts, and cast them into the Reed Sea. There remained not one locust in all the coast of Egypt. But Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart, so that he would not let the children of Israel go. All right, we have a decent amount going on in these verses that doesn't show up on a first read. It's not right there for the average English reader. So let's dig into it a little bit more. First, we have to cover a military metaphor, because while these are likely intended to be read as literal locusts in this story, in the ancient world, locusts were often used as a metaphor for invading armies. So while you can read these as literal locusts, there is also, I think, a subtext And Michael Morales backs this up in his Exodus Old and New work, that these locusts are actually foreshadowing the destruction, as he says, of the Egyptian hosts in the sea, which is to come in a few chapters. It's like the locusts are a prophetic theater of what's to come. Now, what many English versions will have as a west wind bringing in these locusts is quite literally a sea wind, or a wind of the sea. This is something you're not going to find in most English versions, because they try to translate it in a way that's going to make more sense to readers all across the world. But almost without fail, when you have directions given in the Tanakh, it is based on the geography of the land of Israel. So a west wind to them is going to be a wind that comes in off of the Mediterranean Sea. That's their western border. So Alter observes that even though locusts and parching winds would typically come from the south in Egypt, in Israel, they would come from the west. So even though we are in Egypt in this story, the geography is using language from Israel. That's just a quirk of the Hebrew text that you will find all throughout the Tanakh. I think verse 15 may have a little hidden hyperlink as well, because it reads that the locust ate of every herb of the land and of all the fruit of the trees which the hail had left. This is the first time in the biblical story since the garden narrative that someone or something is said to have eaten fruit from a tree. So, again, maybe I'm stretching a little bit here, but I see this as decreation language yet again. The last time we have in the biblical narrative someone eating fruit from a tree, that is an act of decreation as it removes humanity from God's Eden. And we have Pharaoh doing that exact same kind of thing throughout this whole story, where he is moving Egypt further and further away from Eden. And now God uses these signs as a very obvious, almost ham-fisted physical demonstration of the destruction that Pharaoh has been bringing internally. We are watching this civilization unravel in reverse order of what happened in Genesis. In verses 16 and 17, we do get a concession from Pharaoh that he has sinned against Yahweh. And also, interestingly enough, he says, against you, when he is talking to Moses and Aaron. And he asks for them to forgive. And this is where it's really interesting to me. He says, my sin only this once, and entreat Yahweh your God that he may take away from me this death only. That is a lot of onlys here. We are in sign 8 out of 10. And granted, the characters in the story didn't know that there would only be 10, but still, we have 8 signs, with Pharaoh becoming a worse and worse person each time, and now he goes, yeah, you know what, this one time I've done wrong. Like, alright, you know what, growth, I will recognize that, but maybe we want to talk about the other 7 signs up until this point, and I don't know, maybe a whole bunch of enslavement and forced labor and all that from beforehand?
There was an earthquake, a terrible flood, locusts. It wasn't my fault, I swear to God!
No? Maybe not? Okay. Well, it seems like Pharaoh is very much trying to manage optics here. He can't admit complete fault, but he also can't ignore reality anymore. And so he's trying to walk this very fine line. And I find it so fascinating that he doesn't call the locusts locusts. He calls them this death. You kind of can't help but see that as a bit of foreshadowing for what's going to come in the 10th sign. Verse 19 shows us God's solution here, his answer to Pharaoh's request to remove this. And I just want to point out, I find that really fascinating here, that every time Pharaoh asks for something to be removed, God removes it. There's such a balance here, and I'm not even sure where the line is, but we have very harsh punishments here that are arguably deserved based on how Pharaoh has been treating Israel and presumably other people under his care. But at the same time, we also see a forgiveness where God is not laying Pharaoh off the hook. We still have more signs to come, but he's also not prolonging the punishment longer than it needs to be. This is not a 3 strikes and you're out kind of thing. God keeps giving Pharaoh more and more chances. God is being significantly more patient than we would be in this situation. And I can't help but think that should give us a little bit of a pattern for how we deal with other people as well. And by that, I certainly do not mean filling up their houses with frogs and locusts, unless, of course, they absolutely deserve that, but you didn't hear that here. But rather, I mean that we often get vindictive in the way that we treat other people. We go beyond the don't get mad, get even, to I'm not going to get even. I'm going to make this worse for you than you made it for me. And I don't know, maybe I'm getting a little bit too much into meddling here when I say that this also applies to parenting, where I think far too often parents get vindictive, taking out their own unresolved anger issues on their kids when their kids do something stupid. I'm not saying you shouldn't correct them, but far too often it becomes about more than what actually happened. It is about this unresolved anger that the parents are taking out. And yet we see here that that's not what God does. He does punish when need be. He allows the consequences of Pharaoh's actions to take place, but he also dials it back when he is requested to. And if that little piece of meddling didn't get you mad, I'm going to try again, because verse 19 has a major, and dare I say even intentional, mistranslation in nearly every single English Bible. Now, I'm going to preface this first by saying I try very hard not to erode your confidence in English Bibles, because they are 90% of the time very reliable, very accurate. You can be confident that you have the original message of the Christian Holy Scriptures in your hands when you hold an English Bible. But, as I have also stated, translation always involves a little bit of change to the language. And most of the time, that's just unavoidable. There's nothing nefarious going on. This is one of the few instances where I really want to take most English translators out back in a dark alley and give them a piece of my mind, to put it nicely. And that is because the Red Sea does not exist in the book of Exodus. I know. All those stories were heard in Sunday school, all those portrayals in movies, they are wrong. The Red Sea is not in the book of Exodus. I don't mean that didn't exist at that time. I mean, it is not a part of the story. Pretty much every major English Bible is going to say Red Sea. That's where the Locusts get sent. That's where Israel crosses. That's where the Egyptians drown later on a few chapters. But that's not accurate. See, in Hebrew, it's Yam Suf. Yam is sea. Suf means reeds. So it is literally the Sea of Reeds, Reeds, like the little plant you have in the water. So whenever you see Red Sea in the Bible, it is the Reed Sea, or the Sea of Reeds. You say, okay, what's the difference? Well, the Red Sea is the lower part. The Reed Sea is a section further up north that is significantly narrower. Now, we don't know the exact location where this would have been in ancient times. Water notoriously erodes boundaries in short periods of time. So just because we have bodies of water today that were in the Bible, like, say, the Nile River or the Red Sea or the Euphrates River, doesn't necessarily mean that they look exactly like they would have in Bible times, because flowing water is going to change where the boundaries are. But it's pretty widely accepted that this would have been further up north, closer to Goshen, above the Red Sea, above the Gulf of Suez area. So if the text says Reed Sea, why do English Bibles say Red Sea? Well, this actually goes back a little bit before the time of the King James, when a couple of major English Bibles mistranslated the Septuagint in this and related passages. So they were translating off of what was already a translation, and if you have ever fed things into multiple iterations of Google Translate, you know where this is going. It doesn't turn out the same way. They ended up with the mistranslation Red Sea. And it's only been more recently, as biblical scholarship has flourished in the last couple hundred years here, that we've realized, oh, this was Reed Sea all along. We mistranslated it. Well, all of this is happening as we have fundamentalist modernist controversies going on, particularly here in America and in Europe. And so we get a bunch of fundamentalists who want to hold their ground on this has to be the Red Sea because this is what is in the King James and these versions that we have known in English. And it becomes a real problem because the Reed Sea is a significantly narrower and shallower portion of the bordering body of water for Egypt than the Red Sea is. So the fundamentalists saw it as a liberal diminishment of God's power to say that Israel crossed the Reed Sea instead of the Red Sea. They saw crossing the Red Sea as this great miracle, and if you said that instead they crossed the Reed Sea, you are trying to say this wasn't actually a miracle, this was just something that they could have just walked across on their own. You are removing God's power from the Bible, you liberal heretic. But That's not the case at all. This is not a liberal versus conservative issue. It is a, are you going to be faithful to the Hebrew text issue? The Hebrew text does not read Red Sea anywhere here. It is read sea, sea of reeds. There is no argument whatsoever about what the original text read. Now, in all fairness, there is still debate over this, just like with everything else. And some people pointed out that if you change a vowel in suf to sof, you can get the sea of the end. And so some have suggested that this could just be the entire bordering body of water along the eastern side of Egypt. So that could be anything from way up north in the Reed Sea, or maybe all the way down south toward the Red Sea as well. I have to acknowledge that is a possibility, but even then, that does not rule out the Reed Sea as being a possibility as well. And that is the more traditional rendering for it, to say Reed Sea, despite how it has been translated in English for so long. So if you ever come across a biblical resource that talks about the Israelites crossing the Sea of Reeds or the Reed Sea, that is not some liberal heresy where they are trying to deny the miracles of the Bible. That is good biblical scholarship. It is taking what is in the actual underlying text and putting that as priority over English tradition, which is what we should always be doing. Let's round out the chapter with the sign of darkness. Darkness! And Yahweh said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward the skies, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt." And Moses stretched forth his hand toward the skies, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days. But all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. And Pharaoh called to Moses and said, "Go you, serve Yahweh. Just let your flocks and your herds be stayed. Let your little ones also go with you." And Moses said, "You must give us also sacrifices and burnt offerings, that we may sacrifice to Yahweh our God. Our cattle will go with us. There will not a hoof be left behind. For it is from this that we must take to serve Yahweh our God. And we don't know with what we must serve Yahweh until we come there." But Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart. He would not let them go. And Pharaoh said to him, "Get you from me. Take heed to yourself. See my face no more. For in the day you see my face, you will die." And Moses said, "You've spoken well. I will see your face again no more." End chapter. This darkness is possibly the most theologically loaded of the signs. I suppose you could argue that the death of the firstborn in the 10th sign is perhaps a little more theologically dense, but there's quite a bit going on in this one as well. I mean, let's just start with God telling Moses to stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt. That's basically God saying, let there be darkness. That is an inversion of Genesis 1:3, let there be light. Now, most English translations will say that this is a darkness that could be felt in verse 21, but that's not quite how the Hebrew reads. I think if we are being most faithful to the text, it seems to me that a darkness that caused to grope would be the most literal interpretation. In other words, you have to feel your way through the dark. Not necessarily that you can feel the dark on you, but that you have to feel in the dark because you can't see. In verse 22, what we have as a thick darkness in English is literally darkness of darkness, or you might even say gloomy darkness. I heard preachers try to take the English phrasing thick darkness mixed with darkness that can be felt in the previous verse and say that this was somehow a tangible darkness that weighed down on the people, like you could literally cut it with a knife almost. But I think that the idea is much more that this was just a pitch darkness with no hint of light. You had to feel around in order to move at all. Verse 23 reads that they saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days. It's literally a man couldn't see his brother. And there's all kinds of traditions that get built on this of whether or not that would have included artificial light as well, like candles, not even being able to be lit in this darkness. That is not specifically stated here in this text, but it does seem to be an implication of it. This is not a natural darkness. It is a defeat of human technology, human ingenuity, human control over the environment, and human hubris. The very social fabric of Egypt has now become invisible. A man couldn't see his brother. Community, recognition, human connection, all of this is disappearing in the cosmic darkness. Think about how isolated we all felt during COVID, and now make it where you literally can't see anyone around you. This would be absolutely terrifying. It's kind of like going blind for 3 days. And yes, I realize that blindness is not often just a pitch blackness, but you get the idea. There's a whole other aspect to this as well that I feel like we may have addressed briefly before in an episode, maybe the stuff you don't know, but I couldn't find the exact place in my notes, so I want to make sure I bring it up here again, just in case I didn't before. You may recall in previous episodes, I had talked a little bit about the early and late dates for the Exodus, and how most conservative scholars will land on the earlier date, more liberal scholars tend to land on the later date. And it's a matter of roughly 1446 BC, or somewhere around 1225 BC. And of course, there's reasons on either side of why to take one position over the other. You can go back to our previous discussions for more on that. I bring it up here because if the later date of the 1200s-ish is correct, there could potentially be a whole nother layer to this sign that we would miss if it were the earlier date. In the mid-1300s BCE, you had this pharaoh come into power whose name was Amenhotep IV, and he changed his name to Akhenaten. Akhenaten is usually how we spell it in English. And this was all in what is known as the Amarna period in Egypt. Akhenaten is quite the character, and he's really notorious in Egyptian history, because he took the polytheistic pantheon of ancient Egypt and said, we are going to throw all that out and become monolatrous. We are just going to worship one god named Aten. Aten was somewhat ishly related to Ra, that's a whole other matter, but what's important is Aten was a sun deity. So Akhenaten, you hear Aten in his name, that's why he changed it, he said, we are just going to worship Aten now. I realized that thousands of years removed from this, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal to us today. But imagine if you are an ancient person who is used to having an entire pantheon of gods that you pray to and rely on to maintain the order of your land. And then this guy comes in and says, actually, none of that matters. This is the only God that matters. Well, that was a very unstable time in Egyptian history. And the next pharaoh to come on the scene was actually King Tut. And part of the reason that he became so well known is because he reversed the reforms of Akhenaten. He said this guy was out of his mind. We are going to go back to having all of these gods that we had before because they maintained order. All of this crappy stuff that we've had going on during Akhenaten's reign, it's because he removed all these gods. So let's just imagine, for the sake of argument, that the later date for the Exodus is accurate. That would mean that the horrors of Akhenaten's reign and the reforms of King Tut's reign all happened probably less than 100 years before the Exodus. So it is probably not within your lifetime, but maybe within your parents' or grandparents' lifetime, that all of this upheaval happened in Egypt. And now you have this battle of the gods again. And you have the sun god being taken out of the sky, first by locusts, and now by darkness. So just when you thought, as an ancient Egyptian, things were getting back in order, back the way they were supposed to be, we have returned the cosmic Ma'at order to our land, not anymore. Yahweh steps in and says, nope, this is all still wrong. Isn't that so cool? I love this kind of detail when you're doing Bible study. And again, we do not know the exact date of the Exodus, so it is possible that the early date is correct and this has nothing to do with the story going on here. But I think, based on the evidence that we have, it does seem like the later date has a little more weight to it. And that would imply that this is going on in the backs of the minds of all of the Egyptians, which could explain why they are turning on their pharaoh and saying, we need to change. Maybe some of them were thinking, could Akhenaten have been right? Is there maybe one God? Is this maybe Aten being mad that he is no longer being worshipped as the sole deity? I don't know. Here we go for the third time today. Maybe I'm reading a little bit too much into it, But I think this provides a really intriguing lens through which we can read this story. And if you'd like more info on it, I will link to an episode of the Naked Bible podcast where Michael Heiser went into a lot more detail about Akhenaten and the reforms and how that could play into this particular story. But let's finish out the chapter now. Verse 24 brings us back to that Genesis 50 connection again, with Pharaoh now willing to let the people go, but still trying to maintain some control over their livestock. And Moses' response is remarkable. He just seems to be getting bolder and bolder here. I love how he says, "Not a hoof will remain." Verse 26, the word that is used for cattle usually means livestock, but it can also mean possessions in general. So when Moses says that our cattle will go with us, it's probably livestock in general, but there could also be a little bit of an undercurrent of all of our possessions are going out with us. So I think the fact that he says not a hoof will be left behind suggests this is focusing on the animals, but I can't help but see maybe a little bit of wordplay, intentional foreshadowing going on for how they're going to take their possessions with them within just a couple of chapters. And you can really feel the tempers rising as the tension increases and threats are made. Pharaoh dismisses Moses, saying, "Get from me, take heed to yourself, see my face no more." Literally it reads, "Watch yourself, may you not see my face again." And Moses responds in kind without missing a beat. "You have spoken well, I will never see your face again." It's a mutual threat, a mutual rejection, really a mutual declaration of war. Both parties have now committed to a path that allows no retreat, no face-saving compromise, no gradual de-escalation. It's almost cinematic as we begin to prepare for the final sign. We'll get into that next week. Exodus 10 is a complex chapter with all the little details that hide under the surface that aren't easy to catch on the first time or even several times reading in English. And that's the kind of passage I love in Bible study because it shows us, firstly, how rich our biblical texts are, how much we have to learn from them. And secondly, how we are borrowing this literature. We are not the original readers of it. We are not the original audience for it. And we have to proceed with humility whenever we study somebody else's literature, because there's likely stuff that we don't know that is influencing the way that the story is meant to be read. And of course, next week we'll have more of that as well. Chapter 11 is really short, so there's a solid chance we may get a little bit into chapter 12 as well, because as short as chapter 11 is, chapter 12 is quite lengthy, so that may help to even out our study a little bit there. We also have some really unique language that is used of Moses in that passage, and discussion of reparations as well, which is probably going to make this a little more political than I wanted to, but it's right there in the text, and I can't jump over it, so we are going to have to discuss that. Hey, that's the Bible for you. If it's not making you uncomfortable, you're not reading it right. I do want to say a big thank you to all of you for joining us along this study. We are getting really close to the end here, so we are going to wrap up our Exodus study in chapter 12 at this point. Obviously, we could go a lot further along, but this has taken us the majority of the year so far, and we do still have some stuff that we need to cover before the year is out. So we'll wrap up Exodus at the end of chapter 12. We'll probably do a little bit of question response, so if you have any questions on the series or related topics, please send those in. You can write in on our website, email cconn@thebibleuncut.com. You can also comment in our socials on the YouTube channel and on our Discord. We really love hearing your questions and comments and feedback that you have. One other thing that I want to make sure I bring up here at the end is we have Theology Beer Camp coming up in October. This year, it is taking place from Thursday, October 16th through Saturday, October 18th in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we have the distinct pleasure of being one of the featured God Pods there. If you are not familiar with Theology Beer Camp, I recommend you go check out our episode on communion, the Lord's table, Eucharist, whatever you want to call it. I go into some theology about that, but then also talk about Theology Beer Camp, and you just have to listen to the episode to find out what the connection between those two things is. But Theology Beer Camp is this really cool, really nerdy Christian conference that is set up by Trip Fuller and his homebrewed Christianity, where they get a ridiculous amount of speakers doing all of these main sessions, breakout sessions, people from all around the country and even other countries, really, from all around the world. Last year they had a map that you could put like a little pinpoint in and show where you came from. It was literally several different countries. I was shocked at how many different nations were represented by the people there. Everyone brings their own beer. You get to swap those, try different ones, sit in different sessions, talk to a bunch of different people in all different stages of faith, very deconstruction friendly. It's a really unique space. If you enjoy our podcast, I think you would enjoy Theology Beer Camp. So if you find yourself heading out that way this year, let me know. We will be there repping the podcast, talking to other people, and just having a good time. So we're really looking forward to that and hope to see you there. Well, until next week, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.